Okay, good morning, everybody. Shavua Tov. We are back in Shoftim Chapter 14, and we left off in the middle of the story of Samson, Shimshon, and the lion and the honeybees. And we really just touched on that. And what I'd like to do in order to put it into context is to do something we don't normally do, and that is to go ahead and do and read the whole chapter, not the whole story, because the story goes on for another chapter or two. But let's go through chapter 14, and then let's come back and see what we can make of the symbolism of the episode with the honey and the bees, to start with at least. But before we do that, I felt a bit guilty afterwards last week because I had presented to you a very negative view of Shimshon, which I maintain is a view, an accurate view. I actually personally think it is the most authentic view. But David Marks kindly sent me an email highlighting to me a Gemara which I was fully aware of, actually, in Sota, and I had deliberately chosen not to present it to you because it did not fit my theory. It presents Shimshon in a very positive light. I can see Paul grinning already. He's already looking forward to this. It didn't fit my interpretation of Shimshon, and so I chose not to present it to you. Now, the reason I felt guilty was not because I disagreed with the Gemara. I absolutely think the Gemara is a whitewash, but I felt guilty about not presenting it to you, at least for you to have the other side of the coin. And so I'm very briefly going to tell you what that Gemara says. You can go and look it up yourselves in detail if you want. It's Gemara Talmud Bavli, Sota, Daf Tet Amud Bet 9b in Sota, if you want to go and look it up yourselves. But basically, it does a wonderful job of painting Shimshon in a very positive light. And as usual, when there is a tactic that you see over and over again, which the commentators use, and that is they turn the tables completely. They not only justify Shimshon's behavior, but they turn him into the most heroic person of all. So much so that the Gemara actually talks about whether that Moshe Rabbeinu considered that in the future there would be somebody who would be Mashiach from the tribe of Dan, and thought that this might be Shimshon. So they're actually making him into Mashiach. So let me just tell you some of the things that the Gemara in Sota says, and so then you will be possession at least of some of the facts on the other side of the story. So the Gemara in Sota, first of all, talks about his name. I was critical of his name, and I suggested to you that his parents called him Shimshon because of the connection to the sun god, Shemesh. And of course, the Gemara says, no, that's not right. They called him Shimshon because Shemesh is actually one of God's names. And this was a praise to God. So I've seen and heard that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has loads of names, one of which is this. But in the context of what's going on, you have to ask yourselves, given the state of the people, whether this name of Shimshon, if he wanted to give a name of Hashem, could have been a little bit less obscure. And then, interestingly, I'm just going to read you a wonderful sentence that David Marks wrote to me in his email, because it's so wonderful for his understatement. He says, amongst the many amazing explanations in the Gemara, and he bullet points these, and this is one of his bullet points, Shimshon's severe punishment for a relatively minor infringement is proof that the righteous are dealt with more severely. Now, I see in that accurate description of what is being written in the Gemara something very interesting. They consider that Shimshon's going off with the Philistine woman, marrying into the Philistine people who were the enemy of the Jews at that time. They regard that as a minor infringement. I think that is a little bit of poetic license, personally. And the severe punishment that he got, of course, was there was more than one, inverted commas, minor infringement as well. So I think that was quite an interesting ploy of the Gemara to speak about that. But interestingly, the Gemara does go through some very, very clever and intricate explanations as to why Shimshon's three relationships with the non-Jewish women were entirely justified, and they also justify Shimshon's breaking of the covenants that were previously made by Abraham and Avimelech together. And there is an explanation there about how Shimshon was in fact supposed to be the Mashiach because of his special birth, his special Nazirut. And the Gemara, I think, goes out of its way to paint Shimshon in a very positive light. So those of you who were upset by my depiction of Shimshon as a thoroughly undeserving leader of Israel can comfort yourselves by going to read the Gemara in Sota 9b, and there you will find a much more friendly explanation, if not somewhat stretched in the imagination. So there you have the other side of the story. I feel I have assuaged my guilt now for leading you astray and teaching you too much heresy. So there you are. You can go and look it up yourselves. Right. So, having corrected that, let's go to our psukim. Let's share my screen. There we are. Okay, give me some nods, please, if you can see the screen with the text. Yeah, excellent. Okay, right. We got as far as verse 8, I think. Verse 9, I think we did. But let's go back and from verse 5. Leon, I'd like you to read, please, the whole of chapter 14 for us, from verse 5 onwards.
So Samson and his father and mother descended to Timnath. They reached the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion was roaring toward him. The spirit of Hashem came over him, and he tore it apart as one tears apart a kid. Though he had nothing in his hand, he did not tell his father and mother what he had done. He went down and spoke with the woman, and she was fitting in the eyes of Samson. He returned after some time to marry her, but he turned aside to see the fallen carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees was in the body of the lion, with honey. He scraped it into his hands and went walking and eating. He went to his father and mother and gave them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped it from the body of the lion. His father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for that was what the young men would do. It happened when the woman and her father saw him that they took 30 companions to be with him. Samson said to them, "Let me now pose you a riddle. If you tell me its solution during the 7 days of feasting and you solve it, I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot tell it to me, then you will give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of clothing." They said to him, "Pose your riddle and let us hear it." He said to them, "From the eater came forth food, and from the strong came forth sweetness. They could not tell the solution of the riddle for 3 days. It was on the Sabbath day that they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to tell you the riddle for us, lest we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Did you invite us here to impoverish us?" So Samson's wife wept near him and said, "You only hate me and do not love me. You posed the riddle to the sons of my people, but you did not tell me the solution." He said to her, "Behold, I did not even tell my father and mother. Shall I tell you?" She wept near him for the remainder of the 7 days that they had the feast. It happened on the 7th day that he told her, for she had distressed him. Then she told the solution to the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to Samson on the 7th day, before the sun had set, "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" He replied to them, "Had you not ploughed with my calf, you would not have solved my riddle." Then a spirit of Hashem came over him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of them. He took their garments and gave the changes of clothing to those who had told the solution of his riddle. His wrath flared, and he went up to his father's house. Meanwhile, Samson's wife was given in marriage to his companion, whom he had befriended.
Okay, what a story. What a story. If you can be in any doubt as to the character of Shimshon before we read that chapter, there can be no doubt at the end of the chapter what we're dealing with here. There are so many different things in that whole story that we need to now go back and pick over. But I want you to try and bear in mind and perhaps consider as we're going along. We're going to actually look at the actual facts that occurred, but I'm actually more interested in hearing your views on the symbolism. Hang on, there's a couple of people that want to join in. I just have to admit them. There we go. I'm interested in your views on the symbolism going on here, whether what you feel about the honey and the lion and the carcass, excuse me, what all this symbolizes. So I want you to consider that, because if we have time today, then I want to come back to that idea of what this is all pointing us towards. But let's just look at the actual facts together. Shimshon and his father and mother went down to Timnath. They came to the vineyards. We talked about this last time. He goes off on a different direction because he can't go through the vineyards, and he kills this lion, and he doesn't tell anybody about it. He returned. It says in the Hebrew, "Vayeshev miyamim lekachta," and he returned, and it's translated here. It says after a few days, from the word miyamim. Now, there is a period of betrothal in halacha, which in the old days used to last up to a year, where after the betrothal, and this was usually done, it didn't have to be a whole year, but it could be up to a year, and it was usually done because when they were betrothed, they weren't actually of marriageable age. So they would stay in their father's house for a year, betrothed to this man, but not yet going to go through with the marriage. And this is the time period that we're talking about here. Now, it may only be a few days. If she was of marriageable age, they could have gone straight back, done all the arrangements and gone straight back, but it could have been up to a year. But it must have been a little while later, because there needed to be time for this swarm of bees to be inside the carcass of the lion. So he returned after a few days, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, And behold, a swarm of bees was in the body of the lion with honey. Now, we spoke last time at the end of last time, we spoke about why he went back the same way to look at the carcass of the lion. And I think most people felt that there was something to do with the fact that he wanted to go and revisit the site of his previous amazing feat, whether it was because he didn't quite believe it himself, or whether he wanted to admire himself about it and to remind himself, whether he wanted to actually give himself strength for what was actually coming along and getting married into the enemy people. Either way, he'd gone back there. He considered it to be an important feature, and he went back to look at it. So what happened was, verse 9, he separated it into his hands and went on and eating it. Somebody pointed out last week that it's a very uncouth thing to do, to be walking while you're eating. I was never allowed to do that as a child. I was never allowed to walk around eating. I had to sit down at the table and eat. I was not allowed to be eating on the go. It was considered to be very bad form to do that. And I think this is telling us again, and certainly the halakha is that you shouldn't walk around eating. Whether the halakha is you shouldn't go around eating comes from here or not, I don't know. But certainly I think that this pasuk is pointing out the fact that vayelech haloch va'ochali, he was eating as he was walking along, is a negative thing. It certainly is a negative thing in halakha, and it may actually originate from here. Interestingly, and he went to his father and mother and he gave them, but he didn't tell them that he'd separated the honey from the body of the lion. So he's kept all this to himself. One wonders why he's kept this to himself, because if such a thing had happened to me, I think I would be very keen to let everybody know that I'd just ripped apart a lion, and aren't I wonderful? But to his credit, he did not go blozzing about it, and he didn't even tell his parents. So that's the sort of the background. And now they went down and Samson made there a feast, because the young men were accustomed to do so. Now that's an interesting pasuk. His father went down concerning the woman. Vayeret avihu el ha'isha. It literally says his father went down to the woman. Vayas sham Shimshon, and Shimshon made there mishter, a party. Kikain yasu habachurim. That's how the young men used to do it. Now, what are we talking about here? Oh, hang on a minute. Sharon has her hand up. Sharon.
Just a thought, if it's not interrupting you too much. We don't know what Samson's parents told him about his powers. And therefore, he had been raised as a Nazarite. He had never gotten a haircut. He wasn't allowed to have vinegar or wine. And yet he may have just discovered that he also had these amazing physical powers when he killed the lion. And therefore, this may be a story almost of self-discovery, but it becomes a narcissism because he believes he then owns the honey too, that he is the cause of his own strength and conquest, and that it's his to give to his parents, that he doesn't yet sense a humility, that his gift is almost supernatural, and that there must be a special investment in him of some destiny.
Okay, I think that I would agree entirely with that explanation and that commentary, because I think that certainly there's no connection anywhere else in the entire Torah or Tanakh between being a Nazir and getting supernatural strength. We connect the Nazirut with Samson's strength only because we know the story later on that when he gets his hair cut, his strength goes away. But there's nothing in the Torah that tells you that if you become a Nazir, you will have supernatural strength. And even if certainly his parents will have told him that he was a Nazir from birth. We discussed briefly last time whether his parents would have told him that he was meant to be the savior of Israel. But there's no way they could have known that he would have had supernatural strength, because that didn't go with the territory, as it were. So I think you're right. I think this was an episode of self-discovery for Samson, and perhaps he was holding on to this because he didn't really know what to make of it at this point. However, what's demonstrated later on, and I was going to come back to this, but you sort of preempted it a little bit, and that is that he certainly takes ownership of this strength. And as we'll see right at the end of the story with Delilah, it's almost as if he owns the strength himself, independent of his Nazirut and independent of his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So I think that's right, Sharon, and we'll come back to that in more detail probably next week or maybe even the week after. So at the moment, I'm interested in verse 10. He goes down there and Samson makes a feast because the young men were accustomed to do so. Now, what does that mean? Who are the young men who are accustomed to do so, do you think? Johnny Halpern.
I thought it was his stag night.
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it? It sounds like it's his stag night. But who are the men? Who are these men who are accustomed to make this stag night?
The Filistino.
It looks like the Philistines, because he's gone down there, and I think that the fact that it says they went down to that area, and Vayas Sham, Shimshon, that little word Sham, and Shimshon made there, in that place, a feast, because the young men were accustomed to do so. That implies to me that this was not a very Jewish thing to do, that this was a Philistine thing to do. And he had already started to take on board, if you like, Philistine culture. It was the thing to do to make a stag night, and that's what he then did. Yes, Sharon.
When I read it, I saw a stag night, but I saw it that this is probably the Philistine army, that these are probably the Philistine soldiers, these strong, young, gorgeous men who are in the prime of life there. Also, I have a question. The word for feast or party is not mesibah, but mishteh, which I don't know Hebrew that well, but isn't that drinking, a drinking party?
It is.
Shoftim, and Samson can't drink, but he makes a drinking party.
Okay, that's interesting. So mishteh is a party in biblical Hebrew. We see it right at the beginning of Megillat Esther. Achashverosh makes a mishteh, and you're also quite right that it comes from the Hebrew word to drink, and specifically to drink alcohol in this scenario. And you're also right that alcohol in those days was based largely on wine, and Shimshon would not be able to do it. And perhaps that's why the Pasuk is telling us specifically he did it, because the young men were accustomed to do so. Now, we don't know whether he drank wine at this party. We assume he didn't, because we assume that he's taking his Nizirut seriously. He took it seriously enough to bypass the vineyard earlier on, so we assume that he didn't drink himself. But there is another point that I just want to mention to you, which the Gemara also points out and explains, that one of the other things that a Nazir is not allowed to do is to come into contact with dead things. So when he was attacked by the lion, and he killed this lion, well, there was no problem with that at all, was there? Because that was pikuach nefesh. He can't say, I'm a Nazir, I'm not going to kill this lion, because then I'll be touching a dead body and I'll have gone against my Nazirut, so I'll just allow the lion to kill me instead. That's not correct. So he was absolutely entitled to kill the lion. However, as a Nazir, was he then entitled to go back to the carcass? You could argue he can go back to the carcass, he's not touched it, but then he scoops out the honey from inside the carcass. Now, I don't see how you can scoop out the honey without actually touching close to the carcass, and that would be a problem with his Nazirut. But interestingly enough, that doesn't seem now in a normal Nazirut. When I say a normal Nazirut, I mean somebody who chooses to become a Nazir according to the halachot of the Torah of the Nazir. Once you muck it up, in other words, once you come into contact with a dead body, or you inadvertently drink some wine, or inadvertently cut your hair, then that's it. That is the end of your Nazirut. It's finished. You're over. You have to then go through the process of bringing your offering, etc., etc. This is the difference between Shimshon's Nazirut. His was a lifelong Nazirut. It's the only person in Tanakh, as we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, who had a lifelong Nazirut. And it seems that even though he messed it up by getting involved with this carcass of a lion, it didn't negate his Nazir status. That's just a little by the by. So he goes and he makes this party, which I think is quite clearly a Philistine custom. And it was when they saw him, they took 30 companions and they were with him there. This is his stag do. Now, I think we see now the character of Shimshon. Verse 12, I think, looks fairly innocuous. Leon, read us verse 12 again, please.
Samson said to them, "Let me now pose you a riddle. If you tell me its solution during the 7 days of feasting and you solve it, I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of clothing."
Let's stop there. That doesn't seem too much wrong with that, really. Shimshon is made this big party. It's full of jollity, alcohol, although he may not be drinking it. And one of the things you do at these kind of parties is you solve riddles, or you pose riddles. And Shimshon is a very generous fellow. We can assume that he may be a wealthy fellow for whatever reason. And he offers a prize. I'll give you a prize if you can get my riddle. And the prize is something which is a very extremely valuable prize. 30 linen sheets and 30 suits of clothing is not something to be sniffed at. So he seems a very generous fellow at this point. But then we see the true character of Shimshon come out in verse 13, Leon.
"But if you cannot tell it to me, then you will give me 30 sheets and 30 changes of clothing." They said to him, "Pose your riddle and let us hear it."
So it's not, after all, a bit of light-hearted fun with a very nice prize at the end of it. This actually is a gamble. This is Shimshon gambling in a way. 1 second, Nechama, I'll come to you in one moment. This is Shimshon engaging in gambling. He obviously thinks he's got a great riddle and he's going to make some cash out of this. He is going to get something out of it. That is a very, very different picture to verse 12. You put verse 12 and verse 13 together, Shimshon does not now look so pretty clean. To me, this is not the kind of thing you would expect to invite your pals to a party and then try and rip them off. This is what it seems to me with Shimshon. First Nechama and then Howard. Nechama. Unmute yourself, Nechama, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what did he go in such high numbers? This is so funny. It's like if he wanted to be the winner because the riddle was so difficult, what will he do with 30 sheets and what will he do with 30 outfits? This is a number that it's good for them, not for him. What is he going to do with so many?
I guess he'll sell them.
Oh.
Ah!
I guess he'll sell them.
Like he used one from people he killed, not new ones.
He didn't say he'd give them new ones, did he?
No, he didn't.
No.
Right. Okay. So we'll see. Okay. So I think he'll sell them. Yes, Howard.
I wanted to ask.
1 sec, Nechama. Howard first. Howard.
I think this bears out your low opinion of him, Johnny, because he doesn't give them the premise. Not only did he not tell his parents he killed a lion, but he hasn't told anybody else. So they don't know the background to the riddle or the gamble. Therefore, they're bound to lose.
That's right. That's exactly how I felt about it, and I thought it was a rather unchivalrous thing to do, to invite your so-called friends and then try and rip them off. Yes, Paul.
Actually, in the previous verse, it actually says that he didn't invite them; they brought them. It says, and they took 30 companions. He didn't invite 30 people; they did. I don't know who the they is actually, but it's them. And the 30 obviously, so it's one sheet each. They're not gambling quite so much. There's 30 of them. It's only one sheet. That's why it's 30 sheets. There's one sheet for each of them.
Yeah, it's not. But they would only get one back each as well, presumably. So it's a 1-for-1.
Yeah, but it's not such a big deal.
I don't know. Change of clothing in those days was a big deal. Remember when Yosef and his brothers, the story with Yosef and his brothers, he gave them a whole bunch of money and a change of clothing, and to Binyamin he gave 5 lots of changes of clothing. The Torah indicates there, I think, that changing of clothes, I don't think they changed their clothes very often in those days. So a change of clothing then it probably was quite a big deal. But I take the point that the principle is the same. The principle is that there's gambling going on here, which I don't think reflects well on Shimshon. Okay, so here we have the riddle. And here's the riddle. The riddle is...
I wanted to ask just...
Yeah, sorry, Nechama, yes, go on.
Yeah, it's okay. They are talking your husband, your wife, and it doesn't seem like they didn't go through the wedding ceremony, because then the father doesn't want to give her to him. He wants to switch to another daughter who is younger. But why did they say Eshet Shimshon? And it doesn't say...
Maybe she just got married then.
It may well be...
The next verse.
It may well be at this point, when he gives them the riddle, it might have been on the stag night before the wedding. But if you look at verse 15, yes, you'll see that it was on the 7th day. The 7th day. So I think we're talking here sometime after this. And clearly the wedding would have taken place by then, I think, from the context.
Well, verse 15, yes?
Yes.
Verse 15 calls her his wife.
Yeah, that's Nechama's question, is why is she called his wife? We don't actually hear about the wedding. So I think
it happened.
Yeah, so I think we have to assume that sometime between the riddle and the solving of the riddle, which was at the end of Sheva Brachot week, by the looks of it, the wedding took place. So here's the riddle. Sorry, Stanley, yes, go on.
I just wonder why you considering them as a friends, because from the beginning he knew that he's a savior, he was told, and he was savior according to the God will. Why not decide that he is trying to infiltrate himself into Philistines' society?
Okay, so that is in fact the explanation of the rabbis in the Gemara, who say that Shimshon was actually a big tzaddik, and he sacrificed himself much like a modern day spy who would infiltrate into the enemy. Somebody you have the idea of somebody like Eli Cohen, who was one of the great spies who had a massive influence on Israel's success in the 1960s. He infiltrated into Syrian society, and the rabbis paint Shimshon in that vein. They paint Shimshon as an infiltrator, somebody who wanted to get at the enemy, and this was a pretext for him. And that actually is the explanations that the rabbis give. I personally find it difficult to square that with the very obviously selfish, impulsive, violent behavior of Shimshon. if you are a spy, we ought to perhaps ask Danny Limor this, but if you are a spy, I imagine that probably the two most unwanted character trait you would have as a spy would be impulsive behavior and a temper. Because that is bound to get you into trouble as a spy. I imagine that if you're an infiltrator, you have to be calm under pressure, never lose your rag, and never act impulsively. We see Shimshon is absolutely the opposite of that. So I personally find that a difficult explanation, but I certainly accept, Stanley, that that is an explanation, and it is an explanation which is put forward by many of the commentators. Johnny Halpin, are you waving at me?
First of all, I think it's Ali Cohen's yahrzeit this week. I read in the Jerusalem Post.
Oh, okay, so we should dedicate this shiur to the memory of Eli Cohen, one of the most heroic figures in modern day Israel.
Absolutely. I think in the Possible 2 before, it said he took the Philistine woman, Shimshon. I think in inverted commas, took sometimes in the Bible means they became betrothed, they became married, should I say.
Yeah, you're right. Vayikach does mean...
Yeah, and
does mean that
the nice way of putting it.
Yeah, correct. I'm just trying to find where that is in here.
Yeah, I think we had it just before.
I think it went, I think it might have been... yeah, he didn't. It says Vayashav miyamim lekachta. He went to take her. It didn't say actually he took her. He was on his way. So yeah, you're right. But I don't think that helps. But I think in any event, I think the context is that she did get married. Okay, Paul, have you got your hand up?
Yeah. Are you equating impulsiveness with the spirit of the God descending on him? Is what. When he acted what you call impulsively.
Yes, I guess I am really, and I guess suppose you would say, well, it wasn't his fault because the Spirit of God came upon him, and that means
descended upon him. It didn't arise from him. It descended onto him.
Okay, I accept that is an explanation.
It's not an explanation.
You also have a situation where you describe people as, you know, the red mist descending upon a person. So
red mist is not quite the same as the Spirit of Hashem, though.
Okay, no, I'll accept that. I will accept that. But I think that if you look at the story as a whole, you will struggle to support the notion that Shimshon was not impulsive. However, we'll come to them one at a time, and you can do your best. Okay, Michael Krauss.
Very, very quickly, going back a little way, it normally talks about his parents going down. But at the beginning of verse 10, it says, the father went down to the woman. What does it mean by that?
I think it was a stag do. No women allowed.
But the father went down to the woman, just the first part of the paragraph.
Yeah, I also noticed that as well. And that's why, if you look at the translation in here, where is it? Here, in verse 10, our translation on my screen says, now his father went down concerning the woman, presumably to make all the arrangements and to get involved. But the feast is obviously a men only do.
So the translation that I've got is not quite right then?
No, I think the translation you've got is right. El means to, but they've translated it here concerning because why would he go down to the woman? Maybe in brackets he went down to the woman to try and warn her off. I don't know. That's a possibility. But you wonder why you need that bit of the pasuk at all. Elisha does not fit in with the rest of the pasuk, which is Shimshon then made a party. So I think you're right to point out that pasuk, or that beginning of that pasuk. I think that I actually did notice that the same as you, and I tried to look around and see if there was any commentaries that I could find that dealt with that pasuk, and there was nothing very satisfactory there. To me, it's out of place. It doesn't add anything to the context, and I wondered whether he went down separately to the woman. You can imagine a situation, you know, here's this non-Jewish woman about to marry the savior of Israel, his one and only child, no doubt the apple of his eye, and he's trying to maybe warn her off and trying to get her to change her mind, etc. I don't know, but I also noticed that was a little bit out of place. Anybody who has any other explanations, please let us know either next week or by email, and we'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on what he was talking to this woman about. Thank you, Michael. Right, let's move on. So the riddle is verse 14. Leon, verse 14 and then 15, please.
He said to them, "From the eater came forth food, and from the strong came forth sweetness." They could not tell the solution of the riddle for 3 days. It was on the Sabbath day that they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to tell you the riddle for us, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Did you invite us here to impoverish us?"
Okay, so this has now turned a bit nasty, hasn't it? What started off in our minds as a bit of stag night fun with a bit of a riddle. I'll tell you a riddle and maybe let's see who's clever enough to get it. And you know what? I'll even give you a prize. This is turning nasty. There's lots in this verse 15 which is of relevance. They said to her, "Is it relevant that it was Bayom Hashvi'i?" It's clearly not. It's clearly not the 7th day of the feasting, because we go to verse 17 a little bit later, and she wept upon him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and it was on the 7th day. So it can't be the same 7th day, because there's a load of weeping going on in between here. So it must be as Leon's translation was, not as I've got here on my screen, that it was on the 7th day, but meaning the 7th day of the week, i.e. meaning the Sabbath day, Shabbat. Whether that is relevant or not, I don't know. But either way, they said to Samson's wife, so this is the Philistines, "Persuade your husband so that he will tell us the riddle." Okay, fair enough. They don't want to be made fools of by this Jew boy that's come into their ranks and posed them a riddle. They don't want to be made idiots of. But the stakes have now gone up from a little bit of a change of clothing, which seems to be expensive because they're saying about being impoverished. So I think there's your explanation, Paul, about the value of the clothing. So it's gone from a little bit of cash. Now it's a matter of life and death, because if you don't tell us the solution to this riddle, we are going to burn you and your father's house with fire. We're going to kill you and your whole family. So there's a bit of blackmail going on here now. And you can see, I think, the Philistines have absolutely clearly not accepted Shimshon into their ranks. If Shimshon was intending to ingratiate himself with the Philistines so that he could at a later date attack them, in other words, he was a spy trying to infiltrate, he has done a very bad job. Because an spy who's going to infiltrate into the society of the enemy, again, now let's refer to the story of Eli Cohen. Infiltrated into the Syrian society to the degree that he was trusted by very high-ranking military people in Syria. They had absolutely no doubts that he was a loyal person until later on when they had their suspicions, and obviously, sadly, he was caught. 1 second, Elaine, I'll just come to you in a couple of seconds. But here, Shimshon is aggravating them right from the start, and they are not having it. They have you called us here, in other words, in brackets, to this outsider, to this Jew boy that's come along here to impoverish us. This fellow's going to take all our money. He's got this riddle. We don't know the answer. We were foolish enough to agree to the riddle, but now you have to get us out of this or else we're going to kill you. This is all very nasty and very unpleasant now. Yes, Elaine?
You can't compare him to Eli Cohen because Shimshon didn't go underground. He went as a Jew and a Nazir, so he stuck out like a sore thumb, and he went to marry one of their people. Eli Cohen went as an Arab.
I agree.
From Egypt.
I agree entirely. However, I was being the devil's advocate. I was being Stanley's advocate. Not that I think Stanley's the devil, but I was being Stanley's advocate and the Gemara's advocate, who do portray him as being an infiltrator into the Philistine people. I agree with you, Elaine. To me, it doesn't fit in at all. But there you go. Yes, Stanley.
And on top, don't forget one of his threat. He was tremendously, unbelievably strong.
But they didn't know that yet, did they?
But he knows.
He knows it, yes.
He knows
it.
That's why he doesn't want to play a game with them, because he's probably in his head, he could handle them. If he could handle them.
He didn't need to infiltrate. He could just be brazen about it. Okay, yeah. And maybe he got that strength. I don't mean physical strength. Maybe he got that strength of feeling about it by going to visit the lion on the way back, on the way there. Remember, he went to visit the lion.
Yes.
That's where he got, and that's what gave him the chizuk. Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, Nachum, you're waving frantically.
No, not frantically. No, I just wanted to ask, do we have a motivation for his behavior? I mean, do we know why he contrived this whole story? What was the underlying reason that brought him to do that?
Okay.
It seems kind of silly when you look at it, but it must have
you have two possible answers to this. The answer that fits in with my theory is that this fits with Shimshon's character of being an impulsive person who cannot control his impulses. He can't control his desires. He is proposed this riddle because he knows they won't be able to get it, and he wants to wind them all up and be a big shot. The other explanation from the positive angle of looking at Shimshon was this was an excuse for him to attack the Philistines and thereby release the Jewish people, or the Bnei Israel, from their subjugation. I don't think that fits at all, because every single time that we'll see it, and there are more examples coming up in the next chapters, each time it's a personal affront to him that causes his anger to flare and causes him to be violent. And on no occasions does he ever say, I'm doing this to release the Bnei Israel. Never. Not once in his entire life, and not even at the end of his life. What does he say at the end of his life to Hashem? Give me strength so that I can avenge one of my two eyes. Mine! He doesn't say, give me strength so that I can save the Bnei Israel. So I don't think that this demonstrates a desire to defeat the Philistines on behalf of the Bnei Israel. I think it demonstrates that this is Shimshon's personality, a narcissistic personality, really, which wants to be the top dog. Okay, so what happens? So now, but Mrs. Shimshon, newly married Mrs. Shimshon, is in a bit of a pickle here. She's just got married to Shimshon, and she's now being told that if she doesn't betray him, she's going to get burnt together with her father and her father's house. That's a very unpleasant position to be in. So what did she do? Verse 16, Leon.
So Samson's wife wept near him and said, you only hate me and do not love me. You posed the riddle to the sons of my people, but you did not tell me the solution. He said to her, behold, I did not even tell my father and mother. Shall I tell you?
Okay, so that's just what a wife wants to hear, isn't it? He's just got married, and the wife says, I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but I'm going to go for it anyway. You ready, Helen? The wife says, you don't love me, you only hate me, you're not going to die. If you loved me, you'd tell me the answer to this riddle. And this is just what she doesn't want to hear. And he says, I haven't even told my parents, I'm certainly not going to tell you. indicating that he does not believe that his loyalty has transferred to his wife. The Torah tells us, Yazov ish et aviv v'imo, a person should leave his parents, and should cleave to his wife. A person, when he gets married, is meant to transfer his loyalties to his wife. It doesn't mean you don't do kibbutz av v'aim, but you have to leave your parents' control, as it were, and you cleave to your wife. Shimshon has told his wife in no uncertain terms in this pasuk that his parents are more important to him than she is. I haven't told them, so kal v'chomer, how much more so, I'm certainly not going to tell you. And that is what he said to her, and she no doubt was not very impressed with that, particularly since her life depends on it, although of course Shimshon did not know that at the time. So what did she do? Verse 17.
She wept near him for the remainder of the 7 days that they had the feast. It happened on the 7th day that he told her, for she had distressed him. Then she told the solution to the riddle to the sons of her people.
So in other words, she nagged him to death. She never left up. 7 days she moaned and groaned and cried. And if you look at the end of it, Bayom Hashvi, on the 7th day, Vayagedla, he told her. Why? Ki hetzikatu. From I don't know what the root of that word is actually. But anyway, he translates it because she had tormented him. She drove him round the twist with it. She nagged him to death, and eventually he gave in. And actually, you'll see later on, when his undoing occurs with Delilah, the same thing happens. Delilah nags him to death, and eventually he gives in. So here we have the story, and Shimshon must have known that this was going to cause him trouble. Otherwise, why didn't he tell her in the first place? In the end, he had no choice because she just nagged him to death. Yes, Nachum.
But told him the circumstances of why she was nagging him to death. Wouldn't it have been different if she had said to him, these guys have threatened my family. They're going to burn down my house. They want to kill me. I'm telling you this and I'm nagging you because I don't know what to do about it. Why keep a secret that's so perniciously wrong? And
I think you're right. I think that's a very, very good point. That's an excellent point. And that shows you that this whole arrangement of marriage between this Plishti woman and Shimshon was really not based on any understanding between them, on any relationship between them. Clearly, she still felt to be a Plishti. She didn't feel able to do that. She probably at this stage wasn't aware of Shimshon's strength. Imagine that Shimshon had heard that. What would he have done? He would have gone to those people and he would have ripped them limb from limb, wouldn't he? And that would have been another excuse to have done it. So I agree with you, Nachum. Perhaps this is telling us, perhaps we can learn from this, that if you want a successful marriage, you have to be honest with each other. You have to be honest, and Shimshon should have told his wife when she asked for the riddle's answer, and the wife should have been honest with Shimshon and told him why she was asking in the first place. Now, if you had a solid, good, loving and trusting relationship, then this whole mess that ensues in the next chapter would not have happened. And I think that's definitely something we can all learn on a personal level from this very tragic event in the life of newly married Mr. and Mrs. Shimshon.
Yeah, maybe she was the spy. Maybe she was the spy that was going to do things to us rather than, maybe they were both spies.
He clearly didn't trust her, did he? Because he didn't tell her.
No.
He nagged him to death. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that's a very, very important point. So that's what happened. She eventually nagged him to death and he told her the riddle. And then verse 18, Leon.
So the men of the city said to Samson on the 7th day, before the sun had set, What is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion? He replied to them, had you not ploughed with my calf, you would not have solved my riddle.
Okay, so there's two things I think here that strike me. Number one is he's right, Shimshon, isn't he? If you've not ploughed with my heifer, in other words, if you hadn't actually infiltrated my inner camp and found out the answer from my wife, you would never have fixed that. You'd have never have solved that riddle. And so that tells you that Shimshon did not expect them to do it, and he fully expected to rip them off for 30 sheets and 30 changes of clothing. He fully expected to win this riddle. And the second thing it shows you is that he is a sore loser, because then the Spirit of the Lord is going to descend on him in the next verse. And I'm going to challenge Paul's Spirit of the Lord in a second on the next passage. But he's a sore loser, isn't he? Because he doesn't say, wow, okay, fair dues, you found out what it is, I'll pay up. He says, no, you cheated. You cheated. You found out from my wife. You ploughed with my heifer. And then verse 19, Leon.
Then a spirit of Hashem came over him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of them. He took their garments and gave the changes of clothing to those who had told the solution of his riddle. His wrath flared, and he went up to his father's house.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Samson's wife was given in marriage to his companion, whom he had befriended.
Verse 19 then, the Spirit of Hashem descended upon him, and he goes down to Ashkelon, and he kills 30 random people who had nothing to do with any of this, and he takes their clothing. Now, is that something which Hashem would condone? Was that the kind of Spirit of Hashem that you would expect, to go and randomly kill 30 totally innocent people and steal their clothing to pay a debt that you have you got yourself by your own stupidity, by making a stupid riddle? Is that the Spirit of Hashem? I would suggest that you would have difficulty in explaining how that squares with the mitzvah in the Torah, which is spoken about 7 different times. V'asita et hatov v'yashar b'nei Hashem. You shall do that which is good and upright in the eyes of Hashem. I find difficulty in understanding how the Spirit of Hashem in coming on Shimshon at that point means that Hashem condoned this behavior of killing people for no reason other than to pay back a debt which he had got himself into in the first place. Sharon.
Yes, I find it fascinating looking at the wording of the riddle in the first place, because it could be a very symbolic riddle, and it could have taken his dismemberment of the lion as something of a miracle, and instead he turns it into a weapon against the community that he is supposedly joining. And also when you say from the strong came honey, that ought to be from God came sweetness. And he lives on a very basic plane of understanding his own experience and this Ruach Hashem. It sounds as though despite his fancy hairdo, he doesn't get the voice of God. And secondly, I noticed that he gives the 30 suits, but he does not give the 30 sheets of linen. And so he leaves before he's really fulfilled his debt.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that last bit, but just on your first point there, which is the symbolism of the lion and the honey, and we haven't got time to go into that today, but we will start with that next week. Because that's really what I want to do next, is to look at the symbolism of the lion, the bees, the honey, the strength, and all those things. And we'll start with your premise next week on that particular issue. Howard, you wanted to say something, and then Elaine, you had your hand up before.
Just slightly, am I on?
Yeah,
you hear me?
on. Yeah.
Just slightly expanding on what Sharon just said, there's a complete mismatch between verse 14 and verse 18. One says, from the eater came forth meat, from the strong came forth weakness. When he gives the explanation, he says, what's sweeter than, or they say, what's sweeter than honey and what's stronger than the lion? He's still not told either his parents or anyone else that he killed a lion and that bees infested it and honey came out. It's a total mismatch there are three outcomes which are utterly different, have different sources.
Okay.
14 and 18, and the fact that he's not told anyone what he did.
So I think you're right in that we don't see the whole story here. The way I read this, Howard, was that he comes to them and he says, right, 7 days are up now, come on, what's the answer to the riddle? And they're playing with him now. And they say to him, what? I'll tell you what, I'll give you a riddle. What's sweeter than honey and what's stronger than a lion? And he realizes from that, those words that he's been rumbled. And he doesn't even give them an opportunity to say to them, yeah, it was a lion and the whole story. He knows he's been rumbled from that. They're teasing him, Howard. They're teasing him. They know they've got him. And they're teasing him in the same way that they want to humiliate him. In the same way that they eventually humiliated him when they poked his eyes out and made him grind the wheat in the being led by the donkey around the millstone at the end of his life. I think that what you're seeing here is them teasing him and trying to humiliate them in the same way as he tried to humiliate them. We're just not told the whole dialogue. And he knows he's rumbled by that.
I now realise from the words, if you've not ploughed with my heifer, which is a rather misogynistic way of putting it, that he must have told her about the lion and the honey.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how could they give that answer?
Yeah, that's right. And it says her, look in verse 17, Howard, look in verse 17. She cried upon him for 7 days, and on the seventh day, he told her the answer to the riddle.
He told him background.
Because she had tormented him to death, and then she told the riddle to her people. So when they gave them this little riddle of their own, they were teasing him. They were trying to humiliate him. And I think that's the irony of the way that the Tanakh puts it. It's an ironic thing that Shimshon is, as it were, hung by his own petard and given a taste of his own medicine. Elaine.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was I wanted to wind back to him going back to the lion. That was the first time that the Ruach of Hashem had come on him, and he really, say it happened to you, you would go back and say, did it really, and where did it come from? And I can't see it. I can't see that as a narcissistic or whatever you said action. You're giving him maybe more credit for being narcissistic than that he went back to revisit just to make sure it had happened. And then the second time that he committed the second crime in Ashkelon, it was also the Ruach of Hashem. It's as if he's taken over by something else. Is the Ruach of Hashem another word for some innate anger that's inside him that just explodes?
Okay. There's something I want to pick up on that you said there, right at the beginning of that little...
Sorry.
No, what you said was he went back there. If it happened to you, you'd go back there and say, did it really happen? And where did it come from? Mm. We don't find him asking, where did it come from?
No, we don't get that, but his revisiting there is a sign that he wants to try and work through it and understand how he did it. Maybe,
but it could also be a sign to convince himself, saying, whoa, it really did happen. I really am a very, very strong guy.
Absolutely. It can be either or.
I don't see, yeah, it could be. Now, you ask about this spirit of Hashem descending upon him. Mm-hmm. And I was speaking, answering Paul's question before. The way I understand this is the spirit of Hashem rested upon him. It's almost like, the red mist descends. And, mm-hmm. I'm sure you will all remember, you know, like Havdil Elef Havdolas to compare Tanakh to TV shows, but you'll all remember the Incredible Hulk.
Yes.
Yeah? Something happens, and suddenly he bursts out of his shirt with muscles bulging everywhere, and he turns green, and then he becomes incredibly strong.
Yes.
That's the spirit of something or other descends on the Hulk, and he explodes. That's how I understand it. Maybe I'm wrong to understand it like that because I've seen the Hulk before I actually read Tanakh, which was a big mistake. Helen and then Marcel.
Two things. To go back to what Elaine was saying about why did he go back, that was the way he walked. He couldn't go through the vineyard, and he went back just the same way that he went the first time. I don't see anything more in it than that. That's number one.
Okay.
And the second point.
Can I just tell you on that one, before you go on to point number two, when he went back, it says very clearly, Vayasar, he turned aside. He actually went specifically. He turned aside from the path that he was going on deliberately to go and see it. So I think the verse actually doesn't fit in with
okay, all right, fair enough.
Okay. Second point.
Right. The other point was, if you could go back down, it says, it doesn't say the Spirit of the Lord, it says a spirit, and in the Hebrew it just says ruach, it doesn't say haruach. So
yes, good, go on. So what do you read into that?
There were, you know, there were bad angels as well as good angels.
Exactly. And
it wasn't necessarily Hashem.
Give me an example of somebody else in the Torah who had the Ruach Hashem, who didn't exactly cover himself in glory.
Oh, I can't think.
Bilam.
Bilam. Whoever said Bilam is right. Bilam had the spirit of Hashem. I think that's a very good connection there. The spirit of Hashem. Again, it's there. The Gemara uses that expression also to indicate that this all came from Hashem, but I don't think it fits with the simple reading of the text. Paul, you have your hand up patiently.
Yeah, the expression Ruach Hashem, when it said it in front of him, he met the lion, that's not a red mist. That's Ruach Hashem. It suits your explanation to say the second time it happened, that's the red mist. But the first time, a lion's attacking them. And then the Ruach came down. So I don't accept that you can say it's a red mist every time.
Okay, all right. I accept that. I don't think you can say the red mist every time. But I don't think also that you can say it's not the red mist every time. Marcel.
Yes, Jonathan. This question of these 30 guests, there were obviously, it seems to me as though there were obviously very important and very strong people in the Palestinian community, because he didn't try to kill them for threatening his wife. He felt he had an obligation to them, and he went and killed 30 other people, just simple people from Ashkelon, rather than killing them. He had a perfect, if killing was acceptable in those days, which it obviously seems as though it was, and nobody bothered about it, why didn't he just want to kill them for threatening?
Okay, I think that's a very good question, actually. I don't know that he necessarily knew that his wife had been threatened at this point, but he could have killed them for cheating.
Yes, and another very small thing about the translation of the word carcass, because it uses the word mapelet, and mapelet doesn't mean a carcass. Pega is a carcass. So it obviously, it seems to me as though it's implying that it was quite a long time between the killing and the going to see it, because by that time it would just be bones, and it would make more sense that the bees made their honey nest inside the skeleton, inside the rib cage of the lion, rather than in the decaying flesh of the lion.
I think that's right, Marcel. I think that's right. And that's why I said at the beginning, where it says he returned after a few days, that it wasn't necessarily after a few days. It could have been up to a year, according to the custom of the time, where a betrothed woman would stay in her father's house for up to a year. That was the reason that I pointed that out in the beginning. The word mapelet comes from the word nofel, to fall down.
Yeah, exactly.
So it means the fallen body of. Yeah. Whether the word mapelet means a carcass still with meat on, or whether it just means a skeleton, I don't know.
Well, Peges seems to be, I mean, whoever's got a better understanding of Hebrew than me, but I would know. Peges seems to be the word for carcass.
I think there's yeah. And
the body of it.
But there's also a word sheled, which is a skeleton. So you might be familiar with your work, Marcel, because they put up a skeleton of a building, and it's also called sheled, yeah?
Yes.
So I don't know what the word mapelet means. Where's Nechama? Nechama, where are you? Can you help us? What does mapelet mean?
Where is it? Which verse?
The verse is verse chet.
4.
No, yeah, chet.
Chet, yes.
Mapelet can be the when somebody falls, nafal, from the root nafal.
Yeah, it comes from the word nafal. I don't think it tells us that, but I think the fact that the bees were there in the first place on a natural basis means that those few days were not a few days. It was probably a significant period of time.
If it was a significant amount of time, then the likelihood for Shimshon to go there, it means maybe the grapes hadn't even started yet. They were just bare vines and they didn't have anything that would have kept them out. So that's why.
It could well be that when he went back, it was in the time where there were no grapes, and therefore he could go through the vineyard, and that's why he's by Yassar, and he turned aside to go specially to visit it. Yeah, that would fit in. That would fit in. Okay, we've run over our time as usual. Unless anybody has anything else burning to discuss, I will wrap it up here. And next week, I want to start with the symbolism of the lion and the bees. What's it all mean? Why a lion? Why the bees? Why the riddle? What is that teaching us about Jewish history, about the history of the Bnei Yisrael, and what can we all learn from it? I think we've seen, just by going through this particular chapter very carefully, that a superficial reading of Tanakh is not good enough. You have to look at Tanakh, A, in context, B, very carefully and look at every single word and see what it's getting at, and C, you have to look at the commentaries, and D, you don't have to always agree with all the commentaries. So on that point, I will rest my case, and unless anybody's got anything burning to Nechama's waving at me. Yes, Nechama.
Nahum found something very interesting. I never knew that. When the verse 10 that says that the father went down to the woman, and Kli Yakar explains that Samson's father proceeded him to convert and ritually immerse the woman as Samson had requested. Never heard that in my life.
No, me neither. Okay,
but so then, Kli Yakar. But then, when she's telling you Samson, why she asked him to give this, she said, my people. So if she's converted, how is it still my people unless she's used to say so? I don't know. But the first time I heard from Kli Yakar.
Okay. I never read that Kli Yakar. I think that the Kli Yakar there is saying that is parroting the Gemara. The Gemara actually says, that Gemara in Sota B actually says that all three of his heathen wives were converted to Judaism. Well, my comment is there is no contextual support for that at all. And as Nechama have pointed out, if it was a conversion, then it was a sham conversion, because she clearly describes the Plishtim as my people. So I think that's really interesting. Thank you, Nachum, for pointing that out. A very interesting point there. Okay, we'll see you all next week. I'd like, by the way, you to think about the time post. I'm just going to turn off the recording now. Hang on. You don't need to hear this bit on the recording. I'd like you to think about the